While preparing this talk, I was invited to participate in an international conference in Bad Homburg, Germany, on religious dialogue and orders of knowledge. The topic of the paper I gave there involved an attempt to describe Judaism for itself as an interreligious project. The point I wanted to make related to the fact that while as one speaks of interreligious dialogues, especially from a contemporary Eurocentric perspective, it is most often formulated through the triangle of Jews, Christians, and Muslims, yet as a cultural phenomenon, Judaism might confront us with microcosm of all those intercultural divisions. The urgency of such perspective has to do with the religious nature of our contemporary war zones, especially around the Middle East, and more entirely, nowhere more horrible as in Israel and Gaza. Following the present Gaza war, it is obvious this is not but another staging of older colonial conflicts and post-Cold War geopolitics, seemingly taking place between two hegemonial secular progressive ideologies. An attentive observation of the motivation and background of the parties involved is highly desirable, and such analysis is often heavily indebted to different concepts coined earlier by influential authors. Two of the most relevant works written in the transitional period before and after the end of the so-called Cold War was Eduard Said's Orientalism, 1978, and Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations, 1993. I want to refer very shortly to both of them, starting with data. Samuel Huntington put at the midst of his analysis of the changing global geopolitics the concept of civilization, which he defined as, quote, the broadest cultural entity, end quote, and as a totality. He uses civilization and cultural rather synonymously and describes religion as its main component. Reasonable agreement, Huntington concludes his introductory discussion, exists on at least 12 major civilizations, 7 of which no longer exist: Mesopotamian, Egyptian, Cretan, Classical, Byzantine, Middle American, Andean, and 5 which do: Chinese, Japanese, Indian, Islamic, and Western. Several scholars also add Orthodox Russian civilization as a separate civilization distinct from its parent Byzantine civilization and from Western Christian civilization. To these 6 civilizations, it is useful for our purpose in the contemporary world to add Latin America and possibly African civilization. In Huntington's analysis of post-Cold War's conflict, Islam appeared as the main adversary of the West, and in his description of the Middle East conflict, it takes a central role. Today, as we just counted 100 days to the October 7th attack, and in the midst of the Gaza war, it is not too hard to remember that a major axis at the center of this conflict is the Jewish state, which some promote into a clear case of the Jewish-Christian anti-Muslim front. But where is Judaism in Huntington's civilization configuration at all? Although the state of Israel is mentioned in different contexts, Judaism was mainly dealt in a single footnote. What about Jewish civilization? Most scholars of civilization hardly mention it. In terms of number of people, Judaism clearly is not a major civilization. Toynbee described it as an arrested civilization which evolved out of the earlier Syriac civilization. It is historically affiliated with both Christianity and Islam, and for several centuries, Jews maintained their cultural identity within Western Orthodox and Islamic civilization. With the creation of Israel, Jews have all the objective accoutrements of a civilization: religion, language, customs, literature, institutions, and the territorial and political home. But what about subjective identification? Jews living in other cultures have distributed themselves along continuum stretching from total identification with Judaism and Israel to nominal Judaism and full identification with the civilization within which they reside, the latter, however, occurring primarily among Jews living in the West. From an internal Jewish perspective, the answer to such question is not necessarily more decisive or less problematic. In 1934, Mordechai Kaplan published his monograph, Judaism as a Civilization Toward the Reconstruction of American Jewish Life. Kaplan speaks of an unparalleled sense of unity. This unity based a strong national identity throughout the Middle Ages. The Jews as a group were reckoned with a nation, and each local Jewry as fragment of that nation. But what is such unity made of? It seems that Kaplan's definition is point to a totality of religious cultural phenomena, which is mostly based on negative one. Judaism as otherness is thus something far more comprehensive than Jewish religion. It includes that nexus of a history, literature, language, social organization, folk functions, standards of conduct, social and spiritual ideal, aesthetic values, which in their totalities form a civilization. But what kind of otherness is it? That of an homogeneous group spread all over the globe in an exilic position, or perhaps Huntington is right that Judaism has never formed a civilization. And yet, Kaplan is also right that this disparate phenomenon of statelessness has spread to almost all parts of the ecumene in ancient, medieval, and modern times, shaping global network based on weak ties. Jewish history teaches us that those weak ties includes also some strong divisions, even rivalries. Following the dividing lines of those rivalries might suggest that they do reflect some real civilizational divisions. So, for instance, the old paradigmatic pair, Jerusalem and Athens, it describes a deep Jewish-Greek conflict, but might just as well apply to an inner Jewish divide, that is, that between Hellenized, assimilated Jews and rabbinic Jews. Another inner Jewish rabbinic division that prevails throughout the first millennium was the one between Palestine and Mesopotamia, Babylon. At first glance, this is an internal Jewish disparity, Talmud Bavli, Talmud Yerushalmi, etc. But this cleft consists of the two sides of the great division of late antiquity, that between Greco-Roman and Persian Mesopotamian civilizations. Same is true for the medieval division between the Islamic and European areas. In fact, Jewish networks, along with the hubs and nodes, are constantly moving in the long Jewish history. The diasporic mode of existence, Kaplan's otherness, remains as a fundamental structure, even if centers and peripheries shift from one epoch to another. This situation has, from a modern historiographical perspective, two main methodological implications, which are quite well accepted. First, no Jewish social or intellectual history can be studied in isolation from its immediate surroundings. Second, the relations of different Jewish centers to each other often produce the same mechanism of civilization rupture as the non-Jewish ones. Both these aspects of Jewish diasporic existence are reflected in the paradoxes, tensions, and conflicts of contemporary Israeli society. Israel, as a typical immigration society, constitutes itself as an imaginary unified community bound together by a shared past and the common vision of the future. In Kaplan's sense, it's a national identity based on a common civilization. In fact, however, Israeli Jewish society finds itself in the midst of a disintegrative tension as a country of immigrants of very different communities that presupposes different languages, cultures, religious customs, and political backgrounds, that are different from each other in all the above-mentioned parameters that constitute a civilization. The above-described mechanism of the internal versus external expression of Jewish intercultural tensions seemed crucial when considering the question of Jewish Orientalism. Now, Jewish Orientalism is a relatively new topic of the last generation. It owes much of its motivation to the second work mentioned in the beginning, Eduard Said's innovative Orientalism, first published in 1978, and the subsequent publication of Said himself, the question of Palestine especially, culture and imperialism. as well as the various publications of his successor and his opponent and critics, especially, as I said, in Jewish context. I have no intention of discussing Said and his critic in detail. The subject is already familiar to many of you. For those who are less familiar with it, and for the sake of my following arguments, I would like to make just two remarks. First, Eduard Said has been constantly criticized for the limited perspective of his analysis, focusing on the axis France, UK, USA, refraining from Central Europe, especially German-speaking cultures. Judaism hardly plays a role in the binary dichotomy. Criticism of Zionism is separately treated, especially in the question of Palestine. Secondly, despite these limitations, Said's view offers a relatively undifferentiated account of the various agents, interests, and layers of European colonial culture. Just one small quote: "This Orientalism is shared by Aeschylus and Victor Hugo, Dante, and Karl Marx." Okay. End quote. Which has often been criticized as part of a victim discourse, one that itself produces an essentialist gaze, a kind of Occidentalism. Common to many reflections on Jewish Orientalism is the conviction that they offer an exception, a rather special case, in a way that not only teaches us some essential things about the history of Judaism in modernity, but can also illuminate critical aspects of European Orientalism in general. Those moments are considered from different disciplinary and textual perspectives. In the field of intra-Jewish and global politics, culture and intellectual history, especially as part of the modern historiography of intellectual and social history, each researcher chooses his disciplinary angles according to his interest and previous knowledge. One can perhaps mention Susanna Heschel, I guess quite known, or Christian Wiese, whom Willy mentioned in the introduction, developed a thought on the post-colonial context of German Jewish modernity as part of a general engagement with the German Jewish intellectuals of the Wissenschaft des Judentums, the early form of Judaic studies, striving to emancipate themselves of inner German and inner European domestic colonialism. The encounter with this situation justifies using the entire toolbox of post-colonial discourse to analyze the Jewish situation as a particular case of internal colonization. Others address more sociological and cultural historical material, again describing the European, especially the German Jewish situation, as a typical colonial conflict. The Jews became, for the European gaze, internal strangers, as against Arab and Muslim as external strangers. But both manifested the same racial categorization, that of the Semites. To quote David Moshfegh, quote, "The idea of the inert, immobile Semites who could not know themselves but could only be known in Aryan cognition represented the paradigm of objectification and dehumanization." End quote. Moshfegh applies this description to European Jews, which enable him to describe Jewish Orientalists of the 19th century, such as the famous Ignaz Goldziher, as carrying out their anti-colonial emancipatory subversive resistance. In fact, the different attempts to evaluate Goldziher's special role in forming modern European Orientalism occupied large part of a topical issue of the Tel Aviver Jahrbuch für Deutsche Geschichte, co-edited by Lina Salaim, Galili Shachar, and me. In this paper, Moshfegh attempted to make this clear above all through the confrontation between Goldziher and Ernst Renan. If Renan offers a rational distinction and Semites, argues progressively in the name of reform movement, at the center of which stands a global dispute between modernity and pre-modernity. Susanna Heschel even strives to depict moment of collaboration between this Jewish reform movement and the Muslim parallel Nahda movement. In contrast, Lina Salaime also based their analysis heavily on Renan, but claims against the usage of identity discourse in such scientific context. According Salaime, the structural thought of a Goldseer does not offer radical separation from hegemonic European thought structure. Thus, she opines that, I quote, that the emerging trend within the science to view German Jewish Orientalism as atypical misinterprets the dynamic of imperialism and colonialism and misunderstands the relationship between identity and science. And afterwards, another quote, Goldseer research shows that German Jewish Orientalism was nothing more than a variety, a dialect, so to speak, of the European discourse on the Orient. End quote. Ultimately, writes Salaime, quote, the internal colonization of the Jews in Europe never prevented European Jews from conducting research that in turn colonized the Orient, end quote. On the contrary, many German Jewish Orientalists strove for emancipation in Europe by intellectually colonizing the Orient. It was less their Jewish identity than their political pressure in Europe that promoted their intellectual colonization. End quote. Indeed, the narratives offered by Heschel and Moshfegh could be perhaps defended against Salaime's attack as long as the entire discussion remained within European borders. It became complicated, however, the moment our gaze encompasses the real Orient, an Orient that was the homeland of both Islam and Oriental Judaism. From a disciplinary point of view, the emancipatory thesis refers first of all to the Wissenschaft des Judentums, which is conducted by Jews. Sometimes, however, it is hard to draw a clear line between scholarship produced as part of the science of Judaism and classical studies within the discipline of Oriental studies. The turn of Jewish scholars to Oriental studies is at the same time an integral part of their Jewish studies. To complicate matters further, the science of Judaism invests in its own inner Jewish Oriental image as part of the general Jewish fascination with the Arab classical roots of Jewish culture, especially in the Middle Ages, mainly in Islamic Iberia, Al-Andalus. And so, with the development of the post-colonial discourse, those intra-Jewish complex relations with the inner and outer Orient also became involved. Islam now emerged as an integral part of this Jewish emancipatory movement. On the hegemonic Christian perspective, it occurs within the framework of racial theories, Gobineau and Houston Stewart Chamberlain as famous names, and their philological derivatives, Ernst Renan, with Jews and Muslims as leading examples of Semites and Jews as Orientals, internal strangers in the midst of European society. From the Jewish side, it is about a positive adoption of Oriental stereotype as an identity figure, as an anti-hegemonic and anti-Christian turn of Jewish intellectuals to the Orient, be it an inner Jewish Orient, Judeo-Arabic, or Islamic. Something similar was already claimed by the quite well-known Orientalist Bernard Lewis in 1968 with his paper on the pro-Islamic Jews. Okay, this belongs to this kind of idealistic Andalusian Sephardic image within European Jewry. Mainly interested in Jewish share in global world politics, Lewis started his narrative with the political figure of Benjamin the Israeli during the Crimean War. After a long quotation from a parliamentary speech directed against the Israeli policy, where the speaker says that, quote, it will not do to have the policy of England, the welfare of Europe, sacrificed to him. Yet, beneath the distortions and slanders of the Israelis' political enemies, there was an important element of truth. The Israeli was an admirer of Islam, of the Persian and Turks, as well as the Arabs, and in his youth had even thought of joining the Turkish army as a volunteer. Moreover, his pro-Turkish sentiments were connected with his vestigial Jewishness and are typical of a good deal of Jewish opinion at the time. O'Connor, despite his malicious exaggerations, was not far wrong in speaking of the Jews in 19th century Europe as pro-Turk and more generally pro-Muslim element. However, this affinity is not only evident in global politics, but also at the intellectual level. It is fashionable nowadays to speak of the Judeo-Christian tradition. One could just like history is closely with Judaism in common with each of its two successors, then either has the other, and thus in many ways occupied an intermediate word, the Jewish Muslim text spirit, but the languages, a Hebraist could learn Arabic, a Talmudist understand the Sharia with greater ease and with greater sympathy than his Protestant or Catholic colleague. From the perspective of Eduard Said in his analysis of the Palestinian situation, the question of Palestine, however, the situation looks quite different. Here, the modern European Jews emerge as representatives of European ideologies at the heart of the Orient. They are the arrowhead of the modern Christian crusade, and their propaganda is based on the entire anti-Arab European sentiment and stereotypes. Similar statements are still integral parts of ideological Zionism criticism today, even if it was formulated by Israeli and Jewish thinkers. I can mention many friends of mine like Daniel Boyarin, Amnon Razka Kotskin, Ela Shochat, Yuda Shenav, Gila Nijar, Ariel Aisha Azulay, Adi Ophir, and the list is long. I don't necessarily wish to enter now this entire debate and its political implications. The anthology, Colonialism and the Jews, the picture was there before, contains several relevant discussions, especially part 3, Zionism and colonialism. Rather, I would argue that they can help us to become of some internal tensions. It can be about the multiple phases of European colonialism, as well as about the paradoxes of the emancipatory mechanism of liberation and the acts of exploitation linked to it. As a political, cultural, and academic phenomenon, European colonialism contains several internal tensions and distinctions. One of the Christian missionary policy, in the case of the Middle East, also strongly formulated under the rhetoric of the Crusades, and against it, the modernist, progressive, universalist expansion in the name of various objective values, from universal human rights and liberation, spreading democracy, to the necessary expansion of Western technology and Western capital, be it neoliberal ideologies or Marxist alike. As we shall see, these general divisions also operate within Jewish sphere. Similarly, the resistance of the subjugated colonizers is multifaceted. Despite some ideologies of peaceful, non-violent resistance, it was often carried out with violence. And one can think, of course, in today's context of Frantz Fanon and Sartre in the Algerian context. In such extra-violent atmosphere, perpetrators and victims, as we all experience on October 7th, might easily change roles. Not only Palestinian, but also Jews exercise this kind of freedom of movement. Indeed, our Jewish protagonist seems to move freely between objects and subjects of the colonial equation. As Hillel Cohen describes in his recently published Enemies, a Love Story, about the Bar Giora paramilitary group, which was founded by Russian immigrants to Palestine in 1908, as one that has violence as an integral part of its ideology and cult. Cohen's right, I quote, my translation, the Muscovites, popular naming of the Russian Zionists among both Oriental Jews and Muslims, felt what the anti-colonial thinker Frantz Fanon expressed 50 years later. The exercise of violence brings back to the repressed people their courage and dignity. What my friend Hillel Cohen completely ignores at this point is a single simple fact. In this particular case, we are speaking not only of the paradox of the victim becomes perpetrator, but of a significant spatial shift. The violent act of liberation is not directed against the original enemy, now far away back in Europe, but against a local, relatively powerless group of oppressed people. All those ambivalent moments of colonial powers, as well as the dynamics of alleged victims of European domestic colonization who evolved into emancipatory subject in their own right were complicated by the fact that the Jews' mode of existence within East and West exhibited cultural and geopolitical hybridity, and that even that hybridity has shifting internal relations over the course of the long Jewish history. Ultimately, it is about the internal tension in the nonlinear process of Jewish assimilation and acculturation in modernity. More specifically, in the context of my presentation today, it is about the paradoxes of the Jewish heart in the European academic project of modernity, where academic discourse is at the center of several post-colonial theories, already in Said, in direct reference to Foucault, and so forth. To begin with the last point, I would like to say something about the particular history of the historiographical turn of Hebraism and Jewish studies as a discipline. Here at the Center for Jewish Studies, I think it might be appropriate. From the High Middle Ages, and especially from the Renaissance, Humanism, and Reformation, Hebraism was a leading area of Christian scholarship. What began in the late Middle Ages as an apologetical literary genre evolved into a genuine interest in the anthropology and folklore of the Jews in early modern period. This scholarship reached its peak with authors such as Giulio Bertolacci and Johann Christoph Wolff. They are speaking about 17th, 18th century. Such a European claim to an objective, universal scientific basis knowledge of non-European culture is nothing special about it. As claimed by Said, Foucault, and many younger scholars recently, it involves intellectual superiority with political domination. What was special about the Jewish case was that A, it involved from the beginning traditional polemical moments of Christianity vis-a-vis Judaism, and B, from a very early stage, and no time to go over this very short list of examples, as early as the beginning of the 19th century, it was adopted by Jewish scholars under European standards and criteria, hence became the science of Judaism and above all the science of the Jews as framework of self-assertion. And C, that those Jewish scholars with their emancipatory science relatively quickly gained hegemony in their field of research. Such a phenomenon has no parallel, certainly not on such scale and with such success in other cultural, anti- or post-colonial framework. These phenomena have much to do with the two other points mentioned above, namely the placement of Jews, now identified as Semites, in the colonial equation, both in relation to their fellow Orientals as well as in relation to other Oriental objects of European colonial power politics, here primarily Islam. North Africa and the Middle East are the two central frames of this tension. The question of Palestine may serve as the intersection of all these processes. It was here that European and Oriental Jews met for the first time on large scale, and it was here that the conflict between secular progressive ideology and traditionalism and the different layers of ethnicities with their respective colonial practices arose from the very beginning. Above all, the conflict of opposing tendencies can be seen here. Jews as object of European colonialism versus Jews as subjects, as free agents of that same colonial project. This ambiguity already characterizes the self-image of the Zionist settlers, who saw themselves simultaneously as colonial subjects, as European, modern, nationalistically enlightened, secularized, liberal, enclave in the midst of the Middle East, and as colonial object, as indigenous natives, under the rule of an external imperial power. Such dissonance will be argued by pro-Zionist speakers as a clear characteristic of the Jewish unique case, which distinguishes the Jewish state from other colonial projects. The opponents would claim it is no more than typical case of so-called settler colonialism. Hence, we are entering here a particular sensitive area because of the controversial current identification of Zionism and European colonialism. Again, on the part of Jewish intellectuals, there are two main strategies for dealing with such criticism. Either any such identification of Zionism and colonialism is vehemently rejected, or a kind of inner Jewish Zionist critique is developed that presupposes a deep divide between Zionism and exilic diasporic Jewry. Here, the dissonance described above was resolved genealogically. The victim became the perpetrator, internalizing and adopting several elements of his former enemies. Such polemics were very central in the Jewish centers around the turn of the 20th century and up to the Second World War, the Holocaust, and the establishment of the Israeli state. After that, it seems to have continued to shape solely the discourse of some ultra-Orthodox groups and small groups of elitist critical intellectuals. Nowadays, it gains tremendously on relevance. As a nice illustration, I would like to depict one of the most central events of the early years of the British Mandate in Palestine. This is the foundation of the Hebrew University on Mount Scopus. This symbolic as well as real political event provide a kind of continuity between the diasporic anti-colonial emancipatory struggle and the possible continuation of the intellectual legacy created in exile, now in a colony of its own. This is precisely why it is so essential for the new Zionist intellectual to engage with their European predecessors, positively and above all critically and negatively. Susanna Escher, in her account of Gershom Scholem's attack on the Wissenschaft des Judentums, uses the concept of anxiety of influence in this context. The new Hebrew University of the British Mandate period had a few departments. Two of the most important were Oriental studies and Jewish studies. However, they were completely separate from each other and remain so to this day. Let us briefly turn to an earlier historical episode, namely a well-known constitutive historical affair, the Damascus Affair of 1840. It is the return of the old Christian anti-Jewish ritual, murder, blood label accusation, but this time played on a colonial Oriental stage. In Heinrich Heine's words, the French consul inoculated the Orient with Occidental superstition. The entire affair can be seen as a prelude to several further developments: the dominance of Occidental political powers in the Middle East, the destruction of the old communal Jewish-Muslim coexistence under European foreign interest in Damascus and several other places that were pogroms by Muslims against their Jewish neighbors, and finally, one of the earliest Jewish global acts of solidarity. The international Jewish solidarity action culminated with the journey of Sir Moses Montefiore and Adolf Cremier to Alexandria and Istanbul. My Tel Aviv colleague Noach Gerber has taken a closer look at this journey in his paper titled Redeeming Books. Gerber is mainly interested in the two professional companions. You can see them on the bottom left. Louis Leve on Montefiore's side as personal secretary, and Salomon Munk, one of the greatest scholars of the Wissenschaft des Judentums of the time, French-German, alongside Cremier. Few decades before the beginning of the French colonization of North Africa, the Damascus Affair marked a double front. On the one hand, global Jewish solidarity movement against the various imperial and colonial agents, but then also the rise precise boundaries between European Jews and their Eastern brothers. The strong philanthropic character of this action does not minimize the clear asymmetrical power relations between the European and Oriental Jews. Among scholars, it was used to collect cultural goods for European institutions, another well-known colonial practice. These two seemingly separate elements are reflected in a letter sent by Abraham Geiger to his friend and colleague Yossef Schwartz in Paris. There, Geiger distanced himself from the entire mission of European Jews to the cause of the Damascus community and questioned their underlying notion of diasporic solidarity networks. Geiger also links the expedition to the search for new Jewish manuscripts. What effect does one or other of these Jewish excerpts have? As I said, for Montefiore, such a move is quite in order, from Cremier, who only here and there was as an idea and interest in Jewish civil matters, it is also natural. But Munch, well, with him, it's probably a bit of unclear enthusiasm mixed with a longing to see the Orient. But I should be warm to it? Never ever. I'd rather wish the gentleman had bought books for the horrendous money. The only thing I hope from this is that Munch will bring back a few unknown manuscripts. At the same time, the European Jews deal directly with question of European colonial policy. This was also about an internal French discourse between the two colonial patterns I mentioned above, where a French colonialist hovers between two alternative narratives, ideologies, superstructures. On the one hand, reactionary and conservative crusade discourse as a repetition of the Christian anti-Muslim rhetoric, recurring sentiments of missionaries Christianizing the globe in a pre-modern sense. On the other hand, a liberal progressive colonial mission where the post-revolutionary French power acts in the name of global ideologies of human rights and enlightenment. From Damascus to the Dreyfus Affair and up to the 1930s and the Second World War, European Jews are at the center of this internal French and European dispute. As they fight to the east, they are simultaneously waging their own internal European political struggle. In fact, this was a major point argued by Hannah Arendt as she reflected on the Jewish European catastrophe of the 1930s. Arendt described the discourse of human rights, especially in Central Europe, as one which is primarily related to Jews, as the only concrete manifestation of an abstract idea. The most central fact would be that both sides, liberals and anti-Semites alike, represent European colonialism and modernity, which is precisely Arendt's main claim in her Origins of Totalitarianism. The same is true within the Zionist movement. At the beginning of the 20th century, no one disputed its colonial nature. And to this day, the liberal, secular, and conservative reactionary faces of this colonial project are at odds with each other. Anyone who follows the news from Israel knows how much this dispute is the center of current Israeli political crisis. I'm getting to the last part of my talk. Jews move in the Middle Ages into Islamic cultural area, into Christian cultural area, and into the space between. Jews also inhabit all those cultural areas in modern times. Jewish centers and peripheries have shifted radically, and this shift reflects the global translatio of political and intellectual power from east to west. Demographically and politically, the Jewish center in the modern era was European. A direct consequence of the Damascus affair was the founding of the Alliance Israélite Universelle, 1860. This acted under French colonial interest, colonization of Morocco and Algeria, and achieving political, cultural influence in the entire Ottoman Middle East. And colonial ideas, universal human rights, education of mankind, inform close to Christian missionary activities in the same place. The Alliance acted as an anti-Zionist organization or as a diasporic political international alternative to territorial Zionism. In both cases, however, it was about the auto-emancipation of the Jews, not by rejecting the European mission, but through complete acculturation into it. In this context, I'd like to make use of Paul Mendes-Flohr's sociological distinction between normative and cognitive life world, Lebenswelten. Pre-modern Jews could separate themselves from their environment normatively and by medieval standards also legally and institutionally, and accordingly, sometimes create a high degree of freedom vis-a-vis the cognitive life worlds of their cultural environment. But can the modern European Jew do the same? If his normative and cognitive life worlds are Europeanized, what positive content can he give to his ethnic separateness, taking to be a hard fact? Could the imaginary Oriental affiliation offer such a solution? From this point of view, one could say that the greatest challenge of those scholars of the Wissenschaft, the above-mentioned apologetic moment, was linked to connecting Judaism with Christian-oriented historiography, namely to legitimize the Jews as Europeans in two ways: through their own research ethos, which conform to all the rigorous standards of a Protestant philological science, and in terms of reconstructing Judaism itself as a historical phenomenon, first grasped separately from Christianity and Islam in order to justify the separate disciplinary framework, but at the same time integrated enough to be able to find its place in the Hegelian universal genealogy of the spirit, of the Geist. It even became, through an apologetic, reconceptualized history of influence, the mother and originator of the other monotheistic religions, and thus of Christianity and Islamic civilization in general. A very popular motive in 19th century Wissenschaft des Judentums. As much as the ideal image of Judaism for these Jewish scholars lay in the Islamic sphere, and although a common religious sentiment of the two Semitic religions was assumed, both presumptions finally led to the same conclusion. Both Islamic and Jewish Arab religious history had to be purified of all magical and superstitious elements. Both historical and contemporary contaminations must be removed. Scientific sentimentality replaced the impure reality of living cultures. This is precisely the progressive moment attributed by what Eschel and Moshfegh to the Jewish protagonists. Thus, as Noach Gerber has shown in detail, Jewish scholars and Anglican missionaries of Jewish origin massively collected the spiritual treasures of Arab Judaism, separated them from the hands of the original community, and added them over to European libraries and collections, the Cairo Geniza and the collection of Oriental studies. The owners of those documents were not considered essential witnesses or interpreters of its content, as it was handed down within the framework of the local communities. Similar was the case with Gershom Scholem, the Kabbalah researcher in the center of Jerusalem, an established center of Kabbalistic yeshivot for centuries. As described by Boaz Hus, Scholem had no interest in such contemporary local interpretation that could only harm his high-level philological work. On this point, too, he was a faithful follower of his German predecessors. Reading Scholem's attack on Martin Buber and his Hasidic tales, it is easy to assume that Buber was offering an alternative turn to tradition within the framework of mysticism, letting space for living transmission of narratives instead of cold philology of original text, urtext. And yet, a closer look at the various discourse on Judaism and Buber's early Hasidic volumes, Rabbi Nachman and Baal Shem, and his programmatic Zionist and at the same time German patriotic war treatise, The Spirit of the Orient and Judaism, clearly shows how much it is about deep discontinuity between his own reconstruction and the current living movement. I quote, "There are still hundreds of thousands of Hasidim in our days," writes Buber, referring to East European Jewry. "Hasidism is corrupt," he continues. "But the Hasidic writings have given us its teaching and its legend. Hasidic teaching is the strongest and most unique thing that the diaspora has created. It is affirmation of rebirth. No renewal of Judaism will be possible that does not contain its element." End quote. So, less than 150 years from the very origins of Hasidism, it is as well need an urgent literary reconstruction coming from the Western tradition. What separates Buber from Scholem is not their fundamental Orientalist attitude, but their different literary strategies: classical philology versus romantic, literally oriented existential philosophy. This focus on European versus Oriental Jews seems to me to be helpful in discovering the fluid and unstable character of the categories involved. What are the boundaries of Europe? And who is European? Eastern Europe is a very good example. What is Orient? Where exactly does it lie between Far East, Middle East, and Eastern Europe as Alb-Hazian, the popular definition of the last decades of the 19th century? But also, what is Judaism? A unified ethnic group or a weak network of dispersed confessional communities acculturated in the respective environment? This was precisely the premise of Geiger in his critique of the Jewish International Solidarity Acts. As you see, I am back to my opening questions and back to the great laboratory where all those questions have been most strongly posed: Palestine, Israel, over the last 100 years. Not only did Jews from different European and different Oriental origins gather there, but they also enter into complex intercultural and intracultural relations with each other and with the non-Jewish Arabs. The triangle of European Jews, Arab non-Jews, stands as a historical game at the center of Hillel's Cohen book mentioned above. Cohen traces the tensions and dialogues between the three groups from the beginning of the 20th century. The Moscovites, as the Russian immigrants are called among the other two groups, demanded from the other two groups full assimilation to their secular values as necessary condition of any future integration. Accordingly, they represent the same progressive ethos, one that constantly contrasts the lowest present place of the Arab people together with the Jewish population to their glorious past, the golden age, as it has been portrayed in the European imagination and research. The Oriental Jews place themselves in the earliest phase mainly as mediators between the two other rival groups. This traditional positioning is especially true at the beginning, when the European settlers were still relatively powerless and when the imperial power was Turkish Arab Muslim. With the change of imperial power, and as the European Jews became the powerful majority within the Jewish community in Palestine, with hegemonic control over material resources, the Mizrahim, even already in mandatory times, before the establishment of the State of Israel and before the massive wave of immigration, tended to be identified with an anti-Arab conflictual position. Already during the 1930s, the image of the Mizrahi developed as members of the revisionist movement, from Zev Jabotinsky to Menachem Begin, and as enemies of the Arab neighbors. Cohen shows that even when the bloodiest and most destructive attacks on the Arab civilians population came from the side of organized Yishuv military groups, it was always the Mizrahi who were identified with such spontaneous acts of hatred. And one can think about Ben-Gurion's reaction to the military act of Kibya and blaming the peripheral citizen, meaning that, of course, Mizrahim, as the one who made the atrocities. The local Palestinian leadership from the beginning and until the 1970s regarded the Oriental Jews as potential political partners and aspires to a coalition with the Arab Jews against the colonial and imperial powers. This hope has, despite a few known exceptions, Black Panthers, Matzpen, completely failed. Against such close look at the Palestinian scene, it was Gil Anijar, in his book Semites, first published in 2008, who analyzed the same complexities from European perspective. In this way, he points out how the common Semite category of Ernst Renan become more and more separate category, where the Arabs were Islamized, reduced to a religion, and Judaism was reduced to a race by the National Socialist, and then radically nationalized by the Zionist. For a secular Israeli today, Jewishness corresponds above all to a nationality. This Jewish identity is not based on its synagogue community or everyday ritual practice, but is written on identity cards. The nation-state law published on July 2018, the Basic Law Israel, the nation-state of the Jewish people, formalized this fact. Thus, Anijar concludes this discussion with the straightforward claim. Thus then, is the Semites' hypothesis in the crudest form: secularism is Orientalism, race is religion, the evidence lies in the Semites. From the perspective of our present discussion, those are all central moments of modernity. Colonization is synonymous with modernization and secularization against religion and tradition as the place of the Orient. In the midst of the local conflict of Israelis and Palestinians today between the two national communities, as well as within the Jewish community, with its current binary division between Mizrahim and Ashkenazim, where the first group stands for national Jewish and religious tradition and second sees itself as universalist, liberal, and progressive, first colonial and anti-colonial mechanisms are at work. In the sense of Anijar's elementary distinction between religion and race, one must think here of the instrumentalization of religion in the service of the State of Israel. As was already clear in the earliest phase of the Zionist movement, it was only the two factors, the holy language and the holy land, that could unite the Jewish people even before they agreed on a common political goal. Only with the help of this specific language and only in this specific place could the new colony attain its specific special significance, which is relevant beyond the concrete settler society. That's the Sixth Zionist Congress, 1903. The National Zionist Project had not only used the secularized religious rhetoric, but also instrumentalized living religious elements. That these elements again regained the religious content over time was perhaps inevitable, especially after the conquest of the holy places in 1967. The rise of Islamic extremism shows similarities not only with the general development in the Islamic world, but also with the development in Israel described here, where Islamic movements are a basic feature of the type of resistance, mukahama, against colonial and imperial powers. The Islamist movement within the old Israeli borders and in the occupied territories connect the Palestinians with a pan-Arab and global power, represent an alternative political possibility of autonomous action, and at the same time, the only political and military opposition to the Israeli occupation and the Palestinian corrupt mechanism of rule. On both sides of the conflict, among Jews and Arabs, vibrant religious movements are proving their ability to articulate the existentialist needs of individuals and collectives. When all the new political elites failed or fell into internal contradictions, it was the religious movement that represented a coherent collective conviction. The role of Islam in the military struggle against the Israeli occupation shows no characteristic that distinguishes it qualitatively from the role of Palestinian so-called secular liberation movements. The same phenomenon is evident on the Jewish side of the conflict. The religious settlers speak to the Israeli public of the same goals that all Israeli governments have strived for through practice and policy for generations. Historically, the conflict on both sides is secular conflict, a typical consequence of the imperial and colonial situation of modernity, which has been increasingly sacralized by religious rhetoric. It is not because the conflict has become religious that it is so difficult to resolve today, but rather the other way around, because the interests of the conflicting parties are so far apart. That is because every colonial conflict is so difficult to resolve. The identity component of the self and the enemy becomes most extreme. This extremism does not come from religion. In religion, however, there is a very highly developed vocabulary for expressing it. Today, for example, there are mainly two religious parties and religious currents fighting each other, just like between Hindus and Muslims in India. Soon, they will also have to negotiate with each other. Whether this can lead to a better solution is hard to say, but it certainly seems to be the only way out of the colonial impasse.
Thank you very much for a very thoughtful talk.